Good morning, everybody. It sounds like you've had a busy day already yesterday. So hopefully we can add some value to the discussions today. And I am delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about an issue that I think is central to Africa's security, and that's democracy. The two may not seem to be closely linked, but I think as we talk through the issues here over the next 20, 30 minutes, those linkages will come together and we'll have a chance to sort of unpack that in our questions and answers. So as many of you will have seen, this past year has been notable for some dramatic democratic openings on the continent. We've seen longtime leaders in places like Algeria, Sudan, Ethiopia ousted, often following large public protests that are challenging those traditional norms. And it reflects the fact that the demand for democracy in Africa is high. Surveys show that over 70% of Africans see democracy as the preferred form of government. And I expect that this demand is going to be growing because we, as you know, Africa has the youngest population of any region in the world. And it is a lot of the youth who are at the forefront of these demands for better governance, for more transparent governance, for more participatory governance. And with higher levels of education, with more urbanization, with more connectivity, those expectations will continue to rise. So I think we'll continue to see more pressure for better and more democratic governance. I would just want to qualify one thing that was mentioned earlier. I think one of the important developments as part of this process has been that we have seen a rise in popular protest as a form of political expression on the continent. This is notable because it didn't used to happen. 10 years ago, we didn't see so many public protests, nonviolent protests. This used to be seen as a Western thing. The fact that it's being adopted in Africa, I think, is a really significant development. But popular protests are different than riots. And the two get linked together, and I think our session later this afternoon has them linked together, but they're different. Riots are violent manifestations of grievance. Popular protests are a means of political expression demanding changes. They're ways that the population is trying to advance interests that they don't feel are being met by the government. And it's that change that I think is really notable. Now, before we dive a little bit into each of these current transitions, I want to step back for a couple of minutes and just reflect on, well, why does this really matter? Other than the inherent value of democracy, it's a good thing, it's a nice thing, but why does it matter, especially from a security standpoint? And I would start by saying that there's a very strong overlap between the lack of democracy or autocratic governance and conflict on the continent. In fact, of the 12 active conflicts that we see in Africa today, 10 are in authoritarian leading governments. And it should be noted that in Africa, all 12 of these conflicts are internal. We don't have the interstate level of conflict that has traditionally been the case elsewhere. These are conflicts that are rooted in political crises, the inability to deal with differences internal to these societies. And some of the worst political crises that turn to conflict, places like South Sudan, Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, are a result of leaders who have refused to step down when it was their time to go. So the lack of respect for term limits, the lack of respect for constraints more generally on the part of the executive are a big part of the crises that we see. So some of the other quick facts that draw out this relationship. Africa is facing record levels of forced displacement. About 27 million people are currently forcibly displaced. About 80% of them, their country of origin is autocratically governed. For those leaders who have been able to avoid term limits, their average time in office is about 18 years. This compares to leaders who have been upholding term limits, and their average time in office is just 4 years. And non-coincidentally, countries that have avoided term limits are in conflict about a third of the time, about 33%. Those that have upheld term limits, it's about 9%. And this issue of political instability is recognized within the security sectors of these countries. We did a survey here with the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center 2 years ago of Africa security sector professionals, and we saw something very interesting, that among security leaders in autocratically governed countries, they saw political crises as a very serious likelihood of a security threat. 41% saw this as a serious problem. This compares to just 11% of the respondents from democratically governed countries. So the issue of political crisis is very real and is closely associated with limited political participation. Better governed, more democratic societies are also have also shown to themselves to be more developmental. So the development performance in democracies has consistently been stronger than autocracies. On average, economic growth rates are about a third higher. Social welfare levels are consistently more advanced. Life expectancies in democracies about 9 years longer than autocracies, and for mortality rates about 40% lower. Opportunities for education, healthcare are also higher. And this has translated into investment levels. You see foreign direct investment from the private sector flowing to countries that are democratic at a higher level. And that's largely because they're seen as more predictable, they're going to respect the rule of law, and there'll be a chance for those investments to yield returns. So we're talking about democratic transitions because the outcomes matter. How these countries handle their transitions will have big implications for stability and development. I would argue it's a linchpin to everything else that you're talking about in these few days. So let's shift back to talk about the current transitions. First is Sudan. So we saw widespread protest there starting in December of last year. At first, just over the rise in bread and oil prices. It expanded to larger grievances over lack of democracy, lack of freedoms, and ultimately resulting in the ouster of Omar al-Bashir after 30 years in power in April. And through many ups and downs, it led to a power sharing agreement between civilian protesters and the military, which has been the real force behind the government for many years. In fact, just this past weekend, we saw a civilian prime minister take office and appoint a cabinet. So there are hopeful developments in Sudan, yet it's still a very precarious arrangement because the military hasn't stepped aside. And in fact, the military continues to control, is called the sovereign council, which on paper supersedes the prime minister and the cabinet. The military still has its own sources of revenue. It has what has been called the Rapid Support Forces, is a key militia, continues to recruit, and has not shown any hesitation to use violence against civilians if it feels that they are a threat to the role of the security force. So the contestation for power continues in Sudan. This transition is just at the beginning. And there are a lot of these delicate issues of how you move past a legacy where the military feels it is the ultimate arbiter of power in that society, one where there's a popular civilian-led government. In Algeria, again, we've seen protest every week in Algeria. For most of this year, it was triggered by announcement by the longtime president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, that he was going to run for office yet again for a fifth time in April, even though he was infirm and hasn't been seen in public for many years. This ultimately led to Bouteflika resigning. But again, the military isn't ready to step aside. The Algerian government has, like Sudan, had a very strong military underpinning to the government, even though there was a civilian head. And the military is trying to manage these protests in a way such that they can change some of the trappings of what is shown on the outside, but continue to control the levers of power within Algeria. And effectively, they're trying to wait out the protesters. Yet the protesters have been resilient. They continue to demand greater participation in that government. Where that goes remains to be seen. The military has been advocating for early elections. But of course, elections, when there hasn't been a democratic process, will be an advantage to those who are already in power. So again, we don't know where that is going. The other main transition that we have been seeing across the continent over the past years in Ethiopia. Here, reformist Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed took power in April of last year, and he emerged from within the ruling coalition after years of growing protest and in fact, growing ethnic divisions that were becoming more violent. And effectively, the ruling coalition felt they needed to put forward a new face. And Prime Minister Abiy has surprised many by undertaking many very significant reforms. He's released political prisoners. He's opened up media space. He's brought in many new people into the cabinet. And so there's a lot of hope for where that can go. Nonetheless, the ruling coalition is still an authoritarianly governed entity. It hasn't changed. The military isn't sold on these changes. There have been a couple of attempts on Prime Minister Abiy's life, including some attack just in June. And so while he remains very popular, it's unclear where that transition is going as well. It's very fragile. There's a push for elections next year. And in Ethiopia. But again, a lot of the rules of the game haven't been laid down. They don't have a history of free and fair elections. Opposition parties haven't been legitimated. And so there's a lot of room for this to go off the rails. And so we'll just have to see. So in each case, the jury is still out about where the transition is going, whether it's going to be successful. And I think that is the first takeaway that I would offer, is that democratic transitions are more than getting rid of an old authoritarian leader. That's just one step. It's not sufficient, though, for actually building a system of democratic processes that are required to actually have a democracy. And I think a good example of this is Zimbabwe. I know you're going to talk about this in depth this afternoon. In Zimbabwe, we saw Robert Mugabe pushed out of power in November of 2017 after 37 years in power. People were in the streets, they're happy. They thought it would be a new day. But in effect, the military was behind that coup, and the current government, in many ways, is just a reincarnation of the old government. They use the same tactics, they have the same power structures, and are in the same place. And so if the system doesn't change, you may have new actors at the top, but the same type of government in practice. I think a related takeaway is that elections in and of themselves are insufficient for democratic change. Nearly every country in Africa today holds elections, and including in Zimbabwe, they held an election earlier this year. Yeah, but the quality of those elections varies widely, and the sophistication in massaging the results of those elections has grown over time. And so there's a wide variance, and it puts more of responsibility on outside observers to make clear-eyed assessments of whether these elections are free, fair, and legitimate. And that is part and parcel of democratic transitions that we're looking at as we move forward. So if democracies are not just about elections, then what are they about? And democracies take many forms. There are many books written on democracy. But essentially, democracy comes down to three main features. First is that there are protections for popular participation. So people have political rights that they can engage the political process within their societies. There's access to media, free speech, freedom of expression, civil society, freedom to assemble, to be organized. That's the first part. The second part is that there is a competitive electoral process. So leadership selection is an open, competitive process. So the free and fair election notion. And the third part is that there are checks and balances on power, that democracies are about shared power. Stated another way, there isn't unlimited executive power. And in Africa, the challenge has often been that we've had these super empowered executives who have usurped a lot of the power within their societies and within their governments. This simple schematic is meant to reflect that in a healthy democratic system, you have layers of checks and balances on executive power. The inner blue ring reflects the formal governmental accountability structures that may be in place. And it extends beyond the traditional notion of three branches of government. You have those, but you also have independent entities like the central bank, a merit-based civil service, an apolitical security sector. You have local governments who have influence and direction over what happens in their jurisdictions. And you have these organized election management bodies. You have rules about how long people can stay in power, term limits. These are all ways of constraining the power of the executive. You also have some civil or informal checks on power in healthy democracies. And these include a media, active civil society, political parties, which set their own rules and their democratic processes, which are important for putting forward leaders who are going to be democratic. Social capital, just the values within a society that have certain principles about equity, about rule of law, about unity, self-identity. Private sector has an important role, and how they relate to the government. And there are also some external factors here. There are regional norms, which Michelle referenced in terms of the African Union, trying to advance some of these principles. There are international standards as well, and in terms of what they are going to respect and characterize as democracies. So there's a whole system. And I think the main point that I would make is that it isn't any one of these that is required, but it's the system, it's the network, it's the layers of accountability that help create a qualified and accountable democratic process. Much like a steel cable doesn't rely on one strand. You can see if one strand of a cable can break, the cable will hold. It's the same sort of system of institutions that need to be created in healthy democracy. And this compares to the sort of structure that we see in a lot of African countries, where the executive has usurped the roles and functions of a lot of other entities within society. So they may control the media sector. They've politicized the security sector. Resources going to the private sector, again, controlled through access to credit or property rights. Rather than there being give and takes with legislature, local government, judiciary, they are directed by the executive branch. On the bottom, we see that there's a barrier between civil society and the rest of the political process. They are not engaged. And then there are external influences. They may be constraining, or they may be supporting. And so as we saw in Sudan, for example, and part of the transition there is that Gulf actors, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, they're very supportive of the military retaining a role. They've been providing resources, they've been providing diplomatic support for that. So this sort of structure is often the starting point of what we're working for, and then what needs to be transformed to bring us to a more holistic and balanced democratic system. So the upshot from this is that democracy is not an event. Democracy is a process of government. It doesn't happen on a single day. It happens every day. And it imbues different values, respect for political rights, civil liberties, minorities, adherence to rule of law, transparency. And when we then look at where we stand in Africa today in terms of its democratic progress, we see a very mixed picture. So, since the end of the Cold War, we have seen a big decline in the number of pure autocracies on the continent. Yet, we haven't seen a commensurate increase in the number of democracies. There's been some growth, but relatively few. Only 7 countries have reached a threshold that we consider are consolidated democracies, where they've consolidated these institutions to extent where there's a sense that they have the checks and balances and the mechanisms of shared power. And instead, we have a lot of these countries that are in between. That they've started the transition process, but they're stuck in one form or another. And so this is a sort of a manifestation of that list with our current categorization of where countries stand on that spectrum. This shifts every year a little bit. I think the main thing to take away is that more than half, some 2/3 of Africa's countries are democratic leaning. They have taken steps that are moving forward. Yet there are still a significant number that are still largely governed by autocratic practices. So why are so many countries stuck in the middle? And we could go into this for hours, but let me highlight a few issues that I think are particularly important and why many of these countries have had trouble building these institutions of accountability. The first is the legacy of big man politics. There is just a model inherited, partly from colonialism and partly institutionalized within African political efforts that creates a highly personalized focus on an individual leader who is seen as above the law and can override checks and balances. And this process continues in various forms. An example of this is what we've seen in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There, Joseph Kabila had been in power for 20 years. He had overstayed his time in office by 2 years, and then finally acceded to elections. In those elections, his favorite candidate lost, but he was able to co-opt one of the opposition candidates, and all the while maintains control of the security sector, of the cabinet, of the legislature. Now he has stepped down from power, but is still wielding most of the influence in the country. So the legacy of big man politics is a real inhibitor for change in building these institutions that we have talked about. A second reason I would put out there is patronage, or what people call the political economy of autocracy, that by controlling key levers of the economy or revenues within government, autocratic political leaders are able to support patronage networks that allow them to retain support even if they don't have popular popular legitimacy from their societies. The politicization of the security sector, few of these leaders could stay in power if they weren't able to enforce their will. And so co-opting key members of the security sector is often a key ingredient of these governance systems. Control of information platforms. We talked about this earlier, that we're in sort of an Empire Strikes Back moment where many governments have responded to the new information communications technology world and are using those technologies to reassert control of the information landscape and of the narrative. There was an example given earlier, but we also see an increased use of closing of the internet. In Africa, the last 3 years, 16 countries shut down the internet during periods of protest or crisis as a way of the government trying to stymie protest from citizens. Another key factor that has inhibited progress or democratic transitions has been the influence of external actors who've been much more assertive in pushing autocratic norms. China, Russia, the Gulf states have all explicitly taken a stand to try to maintain that norm within Africa. And regional norms. So we talked about the African Union taking some very progressive stances on democracy. Unfortunately, it hasn't been consistently upheld. And so that has given a pass to a number of leaders who have tried to evade those norms. And I throw in there, we need to recognize many of these countries have weak states. They may be moving towards democracy, but they face challenges from violent extremist organizations, transnational organized criminal groups, or whatever. And this inhibits their ability to move forward with their democratic changes. But we shouldn't forget that there are also positive factors. There's a momentum for democratic change. As I mentioned, you have higher expectations among the youth, and there is a growing and active civil society. And in fact, the research shows that the more organized and cohesive the civil society is in a country, the better able it is to sustain the change that's needed to realize democratic transitions. And this is important because if we accept that democratic change really requires institutional change, that means it's going to take some time. You're going to have to, stay with it. You have to have resiliency. And a weak civil society may be able to organize a protest, but they can't then sustain the pressure for change. And so that's what's interesting about Sudan and Algeria, is that the civil society is showing they can stay with it. And we'll see if they are able to keep their government's feet to the fire and affect the genuine change that they're looking for. Access to independent sources of information has been a big power lever for societies. People can get themselves organized, they can share information, they're more aware, they can shine a light of transparency on their governments. We mentioned social capital and norms of equity. These are important factors that contribute to unity and a sense of equity within society, basic rights. I mentioned conflict. Countries that have had conflict tend to be more polarized. Their political systems are more polarized. It's harder to reach agreement and build the trust that you need in a political system based on dialogue and compromise, like democracies. And so countries that haven't had conflict are in a stronger starting point. Not to say that countries that have been in conflict can't, but they are starting from a deficit. Diversified economies. Again, the political economy of autocracy is linked closely to controlling revenues from within government, and there's over 50% of resource-rich countries in Africa are autocratically governed. And so there's a close relationship between access to those sizable revenues and then how they are used to support patronage networks. And then last thing I put in there is the international incentives, that international norms matter, regional norms matter. And research shows that regional norms contribute several levels on the democratic categorization index, one way or the other, depending on what the neighbors' standards are. And similarly, international norms have been important, not just in Africa. We've seen this in Europe, in Asia, South America, as more countries move towards democracy, and that becomes the expectation, then it creates a momentum for change. All right, so to wrap up, let me just highlight a few takeaways on some of the things that we've talked about. First is that democracy matters. It isn't just a nice thing, but it has a lot of follow-on implications for security, governance, and development in these societies. And so from the U.S. standpoint, stability and development being part of our national interest, it's an important organizing framework, I think, for U.S. engagement in Africa. It's, I think, a unifying platform for interagency dialogue. Saying that democracy matters also means that we need to know the difference between whether a country is moving in a democratic direction or not. Too often we just put all countries together and we're not making the appropriate differentiation of who's actually taking the hard steps to gain legitimacy versus others. Recognizing that democracy matters, the question is, what do you do? So the second point is, we can do, and if we accept that the framework of transition requires building institutions, an important way the U.S. can engage is looking at specific institutions that it can help to strengthen and building these networks of accountability that will help African reformers to be more successful. And as I said, and as we saw in the schematic, there's a whole host of such institutions. There's no one magic bullet, but the whole realm of institutions that can help create more independent and a more effective power sharing framework will help to advance the democratic transitions across the continent. I should say it's not about picking winners or losers, but it's about making sure that the institutions are effective and balanced. So not about getting behind one candidate, but making sure that the election management body or the election commission is organized in a coherent, fair, and an equitable manner. I highlight independent media here and access to information. And I just said that all factors of accountability matter, and it's the combination that makes them strongest. But all of them depend on information. And so if there's a canary in the coal mine, it's access to information and protection for journalists. Because if there's dialogue within a society, then they can talk, then they can have debates. You can have different points of view. You can have independent initiatives. If you don't have that, then people are marginalized. And the only way they can express themselves are through processes outside the legal system. The next point is upholding international norms. And this is all about setting the bar. And, how low or how high is that bar going to be? And there's a sense by most observers that the bar has been lowering the last 4 or 5 years, that it doesn't take as much to be considered a democracy as it used to. And not surprisingly, we're seeing more flimsy elections. Since 2014, we've seen 8 leaders evade term limits that previously had them in place. That had followed a period of 10 years where that process had largely slowed. And so we are seeing some backsliding, even among countries that have previously been at the forefront of the reform process. And then last point I would emphasize is the importance of enhancing a professional security sector. That authoritarians succeed when they can politicize the security sector and then use that coercive force to intimidate opponents and advance their own political interest, which aren't necessarily the public interest. And so the more an apolitical, merit-based security service respects the rule of law and the Constitution rather than a particular regime can be established, the more it's going to advance democracy on the continent. So in some 2/3 of Africa's countries are in the process of democratic transitions today. It's a big group. And supporting stronger democratic institutions, I think, is a sound strategy for the U.S. in terms of advancing U.S. interest, advancing African interest. But to do so, we have to be smart enough to recognize which countries are actually making the hard steps towards democratic change. We need to incentivize and reward those who are taking those steps, and then we need to sustain that engagement. So with that, let me stop and we'll open it up. Thank you.